I'm sorry, sir. We can't do that for you. Richard stared at the receptionist. I only need one phone call. I understand, but I can't help you. Richard looked down at himself, then back at the woman. For the first time in years, he had no wallet, no phone, no bank card, and no way to prove who he was. He walked away quietly. Then another person refused him. Then another. But just when Richard thought his day couldn't get any worse, a stranger stopped him and said 4 words that changed everything. I'll help you. Come with me. Richard followed her. He had no idea that those 4 words would eventually lead him straight to a secret inside his own company. And what Richard discovered next would make him question everyone he had trusted. The morning was already busy when Richard Hale walked into the headquarters of his company in central London. At 52, Richard was still the kind of owner who preferred to see things for himself rather than simply rely on reports. He greeted several employees as he walked through the office before entering his private meeting room. Emily Parker, his executive assistant, was already waiting for him with a folder on the table. Morning, Richard. Morning. What's first? The Manchester branch report. Richard opened the folder. The numbers looked good. Very good. Sales were up, operating costs were down, and the branch appeared to be performing better than it had the previous year. Richard studied the figures carefully. Marcus sent this yesterday. Yes, Emily replied. He said the branch is ahead of target. Richard nodded. Marcus Reed had managed the Manchester branch for several years. He was experienced, confident, and had always presented himself as someone who understood the business. But Richard had learned something during his years in business. Good numbers didn't always tell the whole story. He turned another page. Something doesn't feel right. Emily looked at him. What do you mean? I can't put my finger on it yet. But the improvement is unusually sharp. He closed the folder. I want to see the branch myself. Do you want me to arrange a formal inspection? No, just tell Marcus I'm coming for the meeting. I don't want anything complicated. Emily nodded. I'll arrange everything. Richard looked at the report one more time. There was nothing obviously wrong with it. That was what bothered him. A few hours later, his driver was waiting outside the headquarters. Richard picked up his briefcase, checked his phone, and walked toward the car. As he stepped outside, Emily called after him. Richard. He turned. Good luck with the meeting. Richard smiled. It's just a meeting, Emily. He got into the car and closed the door. As the car pulled away from the building, Richard looked through the window at the city passing by. He believed he was traveling to Manchester to understand why the branch was performing so well. He had no idea that before the day was over, he would lose something far more important than a business document. And he certainly had no idea that the answers he was looking for were already sitting inside the report he had just carried out of his office. By early afternoon, Richard arrived at the Manchester branch. The office looked exactly as he expected. Employees were working at their desks, phones were ringing, and people moved between meetings with the usual pressure of a busy business day. Marcus Reed met him at the entrance with a confident smile. Richard, good to see you. Good to see you too, Marcus. They shook hands. Marcus led him into the conference room, where several department heads were waiting. The meeting began with a presentation about the branch's performance. Every chart looked impressive. Sales had increased. Customer complaints had fallen. Productivity had improved. Richard listened carefully. But instead of being impressed, he became more curious. Those are significant improvements, he said. What changed? Marcus smiled. The team finally found its rhythm. Richard looked around the table. And the staff turnover. Marcus paused for half a second. We've had a few departures, but nothing unusual. Richard noticed the hesitation. He didn't challenge him. Fair enough. The meeting continued. Near the end, Richard asked to see the original operational records rather than the summary report. Marcus immediately said he could have them prepared. Richard nodded. Tomorrow is fine. There was no reason to create tension during the meeting. Afterward, Marcus walked Richard toward the exit. I hope you're satisfied. I'll have a better answer after I've looked through everything. Marcus smiled again. Of course. Richard thanked the staff and left the building. Outside, his driver was waiting. Richard checked the time. He had several hours before his next appointment, so he decided to have lunch at a restaurant nearby. He got into the taxi and gave the driver the address. During the journey, his phone rang. It was Emily. Richard answered while looking through the information for his afternoon appointment. For a moment, he placed his wallet and phone beside him on the seat. Then the taxi stopped outside the restaurant. Richard ended the call, picked up his briefcase, and stepped out. The taxi disappeared into traffic. Richard walked toward the restaurant. He had no idea that two of the most important things he owned were still sitting on the back seat of that taxi. And he wouldn't realize they were missing until the taxi was already far away. Richard walked into the restaurant, chose a table near the window, and ordered a coffee and something to eat. He was still thinking about the Manchester branch. Marcus had answered every question confidently, but Richard couldn't forget that brief hesitation when he asked about staff turnover. He took out his phone to check the time. His hand stopped. The phone wasn't in his pocket. Richard checked the other pocket. Nothing. He opened his briefcase. Still nothing. Then he remembered. The taxi. He had placed the phone and wallet beside him on the back seat. Richard immediately walked back outside and looked down the road. The taxi was gone. He tried to remember the vehicle number, but he had been distracted during the journey. He returned to the restaurant and asked the receptionist if anyone had found a phone or wallet. Nothing had been handed in. Richard called the taxi company using the restaurant's public number, but without the driver's name or vehicle details, there was little they could do immediately. He stood outside for a moment, thinking. Normally, this would have taken him less than 5 minutes to solve. He would call his assistant, cancel the cards, contact the bank, arrange a replacement phone. But now his phone was gone. His bank cards were gone. His identification was gone. Even the contacts he needed were stored on the phone. For the first time in years, Richard found himself in a strangely helpless position. He walked into a nearby hotel and politely explained what had happened. "I'm sorry, sir," the receptionist said. "We don't allow guests or members of the public to use the staff phones for personal calls." Richard thanked her and left. He tried a nearby cafe. The answer was similar. The owner listened to his explanation but shook his head. "I understand, but I can't let people make calls and leave without paying." Richard didn't argue. He simply walked back onto the pavement. A few minutes later, he tried asking another person for help. The man barely looked up. "Sorry, I'm in a hurry." Richard nodded. "That's fine." He watched the man walk away. 3 people. 3 refusals. None of them knew who Richard was. And for the first time, Richard understood something uncomfortable. Without his wallet, his phone, his business card, or his expensive clothes, he was simply another stranger asking for help. Then, as he stood outside the building wondering what to do next, a woman's voice came from behind him. "Are you all right?" Richard turned. The woman was holding a shopping bag and looking at him with genuine concern. He hesitated before answering. "I've lost my phone and wallet." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said something Richard hadn't heard from anyone else that afternoon. "I can help you make a call." Richard looked at her. He had no idea who she was. She had no idea who he was. And yet, she was the first person that day who had decided to help him without asking what he could give her in return. Richard followed her toward the public phone. He still believed he was simply trying to recover his belongings. He didn't know that the phone call he was about to make would lead him back to the one problem he had left behind at his company. Richard reached the public phone and dialed the only number he could remember without his phone. Emily answered. "Richard, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you. I lost my phone and wallet." There was a short silence. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I need you to contact the bank and start the process of securing my accounts. Then I want you to arrange a replacement phone. I'll handle it." Richard paused. "There's something else." "What?" "Tell me what happened after I left the Manchester branch." Emily became quiet. "Why?" Because something about that meeting didn't feel right. She hesitated. Richard, someone from the branch tried to contact me. Who? Sarah Collins. Richard knew the name. Sarah worked in the Manchester office. What did she say? She didn't say much. She only asked whether she could speak to you privately. Did she explain why? No, but she sounded frightened. Richard's expression changed. Frightened? Yes. Richard looked at the woman who had helped him. She was waiting nearby, giving him privacy. Emily, don't tell Marcus that you've spoken to me. Why? Because I don't want him to know what I'm doing yet. Richard ended the call. He thanked the woman who had helped him, but she refused when he offered to repay her for the phone call. It's only a phone call, she said. Richard watched her walk away. Then he looked back toward the Manchester branch. Something was wrong. He knew the city well enough to find his way back. He didn't need anyone to guide him. He simply needed to understand why Sarah had sounded afraid. Richard returned to the area around the branch and waited outside. After several minutes, he saw Sarah leave the building. She looked around before walking toward the car park. Richard approached her. Sarah. She stopped. Yes. Emily said you were trying to reach Richard. Sarah looked at him carefully. I was. Why? She lowered her voice. Because something is happening inside that office. Richard stayed silent. Sarah looked toward the building. Marcus has been changing the reports. Richard's face tightened. What reports? The same reports Richard saw today. She took a breath. I kept copies because I knew one day someone would ask me what was really happening. Then she looked directly at Richard. But if Marcus finds out I gave you those documents, I'll lose my job. Richard stared at her. What exactly did you keep? Sarah slowly opened her bag. And when Richard saw what she pulled out, he realized the problem inside his company was much bigger than a few false numbers. Sarah pulled several printed documents from her bag. These are copies of the original reports, she said. I kept them before Marcus changed the figures. Richard studied the pages. The difference was obvious. The official report showed the branch making strong profits. The original figures showed something completely different. Costs were higher. Several contracts had been lost. And employee turnover was much worse than Marcus had reported. Richard turned another page. Why would he do this? Sarah swallowed. He wants the promotion to regional director. If the Manchester branch keeps appearing successful, he gets exactly what he wants. Richard looked through the documents again. But why didn't you report him? I tried. Sarah explained that she had raised concerns with Marcus first. Instead of investigating, he warned her that accusing management without proof could damage her career. After that, she began keeping copies of the original records. Richard understood why she had been frightened. Then he noticed something strange. One of the documents contained an approval marked with his name. Richard stared at it. I never approved this. Sarah looked confused. You didn't? No. He turned the page over. There was a digital approval attached to a financial decision Richard had never seen. Someone had used his authority without his knowledge. Richard's expression hardened. This isn't just about changing numbers. Sarah shook her head. No. Richard looked toward the company building. For years, he had trusted the reports placed in front of him. Now he was holding evidence that someone inside his own company had been using his name to hide the truth. He could walk into that office immediately and confront Marcus. But Richard stopped himself. If Marcus had managed to hide this for months, confronting him without securing the evidence could give him time to destroy everything. Richard handed the documents back to Sarah. Don't tell anyone you showed me these. Sarah nodded. Richard turned toward the building. He had lost his phone. He had lost his wallet. But now he had discovered something much more serious. Someone inside his company had been pretending to speak for him. And Richard had one final question. How much had Marcus done in his name, and who else knew about it? Richard did not confront Marcus that evening. He knew an accusation without properly secured evidence could turn into a battle of words. Instead, He called Emily again from a public phone and told her to contact the company's legal advisor. He asked her to obtain the original financial records from headquarters and compare them with the reports Marcus had submitted. If the figures don't match, Richard said, I want everything documented before anyone confronts him. Emily understood. By the following morning, Richard had enough information to confirm what Sarah had told him. The figures had been altered. But there was something else. Several approvals connected to Richard's name had been made using an internal account that Marcus had access to. Richard finally understood the scale of the deception. Marcus hadn't simply exaggerated the branch's performance. He had been creating a false record that made it appear Richard had approved decisions he had never even seen. Richard returned to the Manchester branch. This time, he walked through the main entrance. Marcus saw him and immediately approached. Richard, I wasn't expecting you back so soon. Richard looked at him calmly. I needed to clear up a few things. Of course. Marcus led him into the conference room. The same room where the impressive figures had been presented the previous day. Richard placed the original reports on the table. Marcus's smile disappeared. Where did you get those? Richard didn't answer. He placed another document beside them. Then another. These figures don't match the reports you gave me. Marcus stared at the papers. There must be an explanation. There is. Richard looked directly at him. Someone changed them. Marcus became defensive. Richard, I've worked for this company for years. You know I would never. I also found approvals made in my name. Marcus stopped speaking. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair. Richard watched his face. The confidence was disappearing. But before Richard could say anything else, Marcus looked at him and asked a question that Richard never expected. Who told you? Richard said nothing. Marcus's eyes shifted toward the door. And in that moment, Richard realized something even more disturbing. Marcus wasn't worried about Sarah. He was worried about someone else. Someone who had been involved long before Richard arrived in Manchester. And Richard was about to discover exactly who that person was. Richard remained silent. Marcus looked toward the door again. Who else is involved? Richard asked. Marcus lowered his eyes. I didn't do this alone. Richard's expression hardened. Who? Marcus hesitated before finally answering. Someone at headquarters. Richard felt a chill. He had expected Marcus to be responsible for the false reports, but he had not expected someone from his own headquarters to be involved. Marcus explained that months earlier, he had been approached by a senior finance employee who offered to help him improve the branch's figures. At first, Marcus only changed small numbers. Then the requests became larger. The false reports made the branch appear more profitable, which helped protect Marcus's position and made the company's overall performance look stronger. The person at headquarters then used Richard's internal approval access to make several decisions appear legitimate. Richard immediately called Emily. Check who has access to my approval account. There was a pause. Then Emily's voice changed. Richard. What? There are only 2 people outside your own account who have ever had that level of access. Richard closed his eyes. One was the company's former finance director. The other was someone Richard had trusted for years. Richard finally understood why the deception had remained hidden for so long. It wasn't one dishonest manager. It was a chain of people protecting one another. But Richard didn't let anger make the decision for him. He instructed the legal team to secure the records, suspend the compromised accounts, and begin a formal investigation. Marcus was removed from his position pending the investigation. Sarah was protected from retaliation and later moved into a senior compliance role because of the evidence she had preserved. And Richard made one change that mattered more than anything else. He created a confidential reporting system that allowed employees to report serious concerns directly to an independent team instead of having to go through their managers. Weeks later, Richard sat alone in his office, looking at the same report that had started everything. The numbers had looked perfect. That had been the problem. He had spent years believing that leadership meant knowing what happened inside his company. Now he understood something deeper. Leadership isn't about what people tell you when you're in the room. It's about what happens when you're not there. And Richard never forgot the day he lost his wallet and phone. Because losing access to his money for one afternoon had taught him something millions of pounds never could. You don't truly know who values you until they have nothing to gain from helping you.